What's going on, everybody? Welcome or welcome back. I hope you're having a great evening. And I just want to start things off with, do you guys remember the movie Castaway? Do you remember merely towards the end when he has all those bottles of water, like 10 bottles of water in his car? It's because he learned a life lesson. Life lesson would be water is valuable. Life is valuable. Okay, and you're about to learn another one of those lessons with today's video. So without any further ado, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. Now you can ask anybody who calls the great state of Minnesota home, and they'll tell you the winters are brutal. And Jean Hilliard knew that better than most. She spent all of her 19 years living in Langby, a tiny suburb in the northeast of the state. And with under 100 residents, Langby barely registers even on the map. Yet, Jean was absolutely happy there. She enjoyed this rural life and didn't mind the weather. And the frigid temperatures of December 20th, 1980 were never going to keep her indoors, not when there were friends to go out and visit. So she set off into the night, dressed in only jeans, a light jacket, and cowboy boots. And she was driving her dad's Ford LTD. And in that combination of factors lay the seeds of disaster. You see, the Ford was ill-equipped for the icy conditions. It had rear-wheel drive and no anti-lock brakes. So Jean went out and she was heading home right after midnight, taking a shortcut along a gravel road to the south of Langby, when the car hit an ice patch and she shoveled around and then spun off into a ditch. And she was stuck. No amount of revving that powerful V8 engine moved the car even so much as an inch. The car was stuck, and it wasn't going anywhere. And that left Jean with two options. She could turn up the heater and just, sit it out, waiting for someone to find her in the morning, or she could walk. I mean, the latter seemed foolhardy given the ambient temperature and her light attire, but Jean wasn't the type to just wait around for someone to come and rescue her. She was inclined to be proactive. Besides, she knew a guy that lived right nearby, a rancher named Wally Nelson, who was a friend of her boyfriend Paul. And after just only a few minutes of reflection, she decided to walk to the house. And it was 21 degrees Fahrenheit that night, well below freezing. And so she went out hugging herself, and she set off in the darkness. And as she's strolling along, she thought that she was making really good time, and that she could actually see the lights of Wally's farmhouse as soon as she topped the next rise. But one hill after another produced another, and that produced nothing but darkness before her. Had she miscalculated the distance? Well, Jean didn't think so. Most likely it was just the disorienting effect of the dark, making her believe that she'd cover more ground than she actually had. So Jean actually wasn't afraid. Rather, she was just frustrated that she hadn't reached her destination yet. And then she saw it. The lights in the distance, nothing but relief. So she started walking again, and her feet were really numb from the cold. And that was the last thing that Jean Hilliard remembered. We know now that Jean made it all the way to her friend Wally's yard before collapsing. We also know that she had clawed her way across the frozen ground to his front door and pulled herself up onto the porch. And we know that in touching distance of her goal, her strength failed her. She just could not garner the will to raise her hand and knock the door. Instead, she drifted off into this blackness of hypothermia-induced slumber. And that was where Wally found her the next morning, sprawled out on the deck, stiff as a log, her eyes frozen wide open. At first, Wally Nelson was certain that his friend was dead. She had to be, surely, after being outdoors and inadequately dressed for sub-zero temperatures for over 6 hours. But then he saw bubbles coming out of Jean's nose and realized that there was still breath in her. Nelson had entertained a young lady the previous evening. Now he had to ask his date to help load up a frozen body, and Jean was brought to the Foston Clinic, where doctors put a low premium on her chances of survival because she was unresponsive. Her skin an unearthly tone of gray, so impermeable that it was impossible to get an IV needle in her arm. It was like she was Superman. They just kept breaking. And her pulse had slowed to a mere 12 beats per minute, well below the normal of 60 to 100 beats per minute. Doctors then shined a light into her eyes and didn't even get a flicker of response from her frozen pupils. And in the end, all that the medical staff could do was to surround her with these heating pads and just hope that it had some effect. The doctors and staff already were talking about how many limbs she would lose. Right now, the amputation of both legs seemed like a possible outcome, if she survived at all. There is a good reason why our bodies react so badly to ultra-low temperatures. You see, human beings are around 60% water, give or take, which, unlike most other elements, expands when it is frozen. This causes the liquid contents of cells to swell when they freeze, forming crystals that rupture cell walls, killing skin and muscle. And I'm sure you've heard of the result, because the result of this is blackened patches of dead tissue that we call frostbite. Now, certain animals have adapted to cope with this, but we humans are not among them. Now, Jean Hilliard appeared doomed. It seemed that only the direct intervention of God would save her. So one devout member of the hospital staff took this quite literally and contacted Jean's pastor. And he started calling his parishioners and asking them to pray for Jean. Soon there was a prayer circle that had formed addressing pleas to the heavens. Now, there's an old joke usually told by those of an agnostic persuasion that goes something like this: why don't you find faith healers on the staff of hospitals? For the same reason you don't find psychics working on Wall Street. The implication is clear. Prayer changes nothing. You might as well be talking to a dead telephone, they said. In this case, though, the miracle that was being prayed for actually happened. By mid-morning, Jean Hilliard started having these spasms, and by noon, she was sitting up and talking coherently with her caregivers. Her major concern seemed to be how she was going to tell her dad that she'd driven his car into a ditch. And within days, Jean had been discharged from the hospital, walking out on her own 2 feet with little more than a blistered toe to show for her whole ordeal. So how did Jean Hilliard make this incredible recovery? Was this a bona fide miracle? A case of divine intervention? Did those prayers do their job? Well, maybe and maybe not. The truth is that while Jean's case was unusual, it is by no means unique. Other patients have been revived from similar precarious states of hypothermia. As University of Minnesota professor of emergency medicine David Plummer explains, the body enters a state of hibernation under these conditions. The blood flow slows as the individual requires less oxygen, and the heart rate significantly decreases. And that's when he said this, and I can't believe he said this because I thought this wasn't real. But then he said the person is in a state of suspended animation. Look that word up if you don't know what it means, suspended animation. And that the danger lies in the period when temperatures increase and the body begins to reboot almost like a computer. Here, blood flow needs to increase at the same rate as the body warms. Now, if that happens, the patient will often make a full recovery. This scenario is so familiar among doctors who deal with hypothermia cases that they have a dictum: no one is dead until they're warm and dead. But this is not to downplay the remarkable recovery made by Jean Hilliard. What makes her case so remarkable is that her recovery was achieved by such primitive means. You see, modern medical technology includes a special device that passes the patient's blood through a heating system, gradually warming their vital organs from the inside. And in 1980, in rural Boston, no such technology was available. Jean's life was saved using some heating pads and a whole lot of prayer. Then, in the aftermath of her recovery, Jean Hilliard became a minor celebrity. She toured churches across the state to talk about the power of prayer and was interviewed on local TV. She was even flown into New York, where she recounted her experience to Tom Brokaw on the Today Show. But the hype soon died down, and Jean returned to her quiet life in Minnesota. She married, had kids, she divorced, she moved to Cambridge, where she actually still lives, working at a local Walmart to this day. And if you were to ask her, she'd tell you that she recalls very little about her near-death experience. She says, "It's like I fell asleep and woke up in the hospital. I didn't see any bright light or anything. It's all quite disappointing." Jean Hilliard also has no lingering health issues from that night that she spent out in the cold, and it hasn't affected her psychologically either. She just makes sure that she is dressed for the weather when she goes out, and she stays away from icy roads on cold winter nights. So the moral of this story, one of them, is to make sure you're always prepared for Mother Nature. And so was this a miracle from God? Or is this a case where the ill-fated word luck was involved? Either way, it's hard to deny one thing, which is, this was a miracle.